What is it, Mary?
I just wanted to say that my sister Bernadette was sick the day the class learned about the Holy Trinity. She misses school a lot. She's always ailing.
What ails her?
They call it asthma or some such name.
You trying to say asthma?
Yes, sister.
What do Saint Bernadette Soubirous, Saint Marshall Mathers, and Kevin Non-Tridicath all have in common? That's right, we all have asthma. The black and white clip that I just played is from the 1943 film The Song of Bernadette, which is about Saint Bernadette Soubirous and the apparitions of Our Lady of Lourdes. If you've seen my videos on the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima, you'll know that I played clips from the 1952 film The Miracle of Our Lady of Fatima, and also that I had to re-edit like half of the video because I was getting into copyright problems. So I won't be playing too much of the Song of Bernadette in today's video, but the Song of Bernadette is another classic traditional Catholic film that tons of people who grew up like I did watched, probably every year. Just like the Fatima film, the Song of Bernadette is sensationalized, and I think it contributes to a general confusion and misunderstanding that trads and conservative Catholics have about the events at Lourdes and the miracle healings that supposedly continue to take place there. In today's video, I'm going to discuss the apparitions at Lourdes, the continued miracle healings that occur there, or the lack thereof, and see if I can't be a measured counterbalance to all of the pro-Lourdes videos that are on YouTube. Let's talk about it. Before anything else, I can actually start off with a somewhat personal story. Personal as in dealing with my family, not with me, myself. I have an uncle who died around a decade before I was born. He was only in his 20s when he died of cancer in the 1980s, but my dad and my grandparents told us stories about him to keep his memory alive the way that a lot of people do. One thing that I learned from him from these stories is that he went to Lourdes towards the end of his life after his cancer diagnosis was deemed terminal. Lourdes, France, is one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in the world today. According to this website that I found, Lourdes is the 6th most popular pilgrimage site in the world of any religion, and the 2nd most popular Christian pilgrimage site, being beaten only by the Shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City. Catholic pilgrims, and non-Catholic pilgrims for that matter, visit Lourdes in hopes for a miracle cure every year to the tune of between 4 and 6 million pilgrims. Why do people go to Lourdes hoping for a miracle? Let's back up and I'll explain the events surrounding Lourdes the way that I was taught growing up. Then we'll do a deep dive and analyze those claims a little closer. Bernadette Soubirous was born in 1844 to a very poor family in rural France. From February 11th, 1858 through July 16th, 1858, when she was only 14 years old, Bernadette reported that Our Lady appeared to her 18 times. During this period, news about the apparitions spread, and at each apparition, a crowd gathered, growing larger and larger for each apparition. The crowd never saw or heard Mary. Only Bernadette could hear or see her, but the crowd watched anyway. During these apparitions, Our Lady would tell Bernadette, "I am the Immaculate Conception," a term that Bernadette had never even heard before. Bernadette didn't even realize that that was a title of Our Lady. Our Lady asked Bernadette to do penances. One time, she asked Bernadette to bathe in water. Bernadette assumed that Our Lady meant the nearby river, but Our Lady says that she's not talking about that water. She tells Bernadette to dig in the ground, and she does, and sure enough, she finds a little water. She bathes in it, and then the apparition ends. Over the next 2 days, that little puddle of water began to well up and a spring formed, connecting the grotto in which the apparitions were occurring to the nearby river. There were 3 miracle cures involving that water over the next few days. A woman named Catherine Latapie had fallen on her arm so badly that she couldn't move 2 of her fingers. She dipped her arm into that water that St. Bernadette Soubirous had found, and instantly, Catherine regained the ability to move her fingers. A man named Louis Bourrier, whose vision had been badly damaged in a mining accident, rubbed some of that water on his eyes and regained his vision. A mother had a 2-year-old baby named Justin Bohors, and Justin was very sick, on the verge of death. Justin's mother took him to the grotto, bathed him in the water, and baby Justin survived his illness and made a full recovery. Almost immediately after those first healings, more people started turning towards the waters at Lourdes for miraculous healings, turning Lourdes into the popular pilgrimage site that it continues to be to this day. Since those first miracle healings, there have been 7,000 miracle healings approved by the Lourdes Medical Bureau, a medical association with real doctors who collect data on the miracle healings and then submit those to the Vatican. And the Vatican has officially approved 70 miracle healings as of late December 2023 when I'm filming this video. That about sums up the traditional story that had been told to me growing up and that is depicted in the 1943 film. As I'm sure some of you have guessed by now, there are some pretty important pieces of information that I did not learn growing up, which are not part of the traditional Catholic understanding of the events that happened at Lourdes. Let's dig deeper and see if the story of Our Lady of Lourdes holds up to scrutiny. The apparitions themselves seem a lot weirder than the traditional stories let on. During the apparitions, Bernadette seemed to act in a way that lines up with mental illness. I will read from a book called Lourdes, Body and Spirit in a Secular Age by Ruth Harris, published in 1999, available in full from the Internet Archive, linked in the description down below. Starting on page 61, another issue was whether Bernadette's body showed any taint of possessive, convulsive, or hysterical experience. Newspapers described how she appeared tired and burst into a short, broken, nervous laugh. Another described how her hands began to tremble and the nervous twitching sets in, while a third described how her lips shook convulsively before the onset of ecstatic immobility. These kinds of symptoms were once again attested to by 3 physicians called in to examine her to see if she required confinement. They stated that at the moment of the 4th apparition on 19th February, convulsive laughter comes and goes on her lips. Even more harshly, they remarked that, quote, later she was to be seen prostrating herself on the ground and, in the height of her delirium, biting the dust. Now, this book does go on to say that it could be that the newspaper editors represented the enlightened opinion and were therefore much more harsh to Bernadette. And it does say that plenty of the observers at the actual miracle saw harmony rather than disorder. Poorer witnesses, interviewed by the Jesuit historian Crow, maintained that although sometimes they were only a few yards away, they saw nothing twisted or awkward on her face or in her body. Literate opinion in 1858 included some notables and a lone priest who attended, and they saw only beauty and spirituality in her physiognomy. I can't say that word. And pose. Even though unconvinced, the Captain d'Angela affirmed that during her ecstasy there was nothing repugnant, nothing grimacing. It was a beautiful sight. So it does appear that some people saw clear signs of mental illness in her, while others did not. Another weird thing about the apparition is that apparently Our Lady did not look like an Orthodox understanding of what Our Lady should look like. on page 57, it reads, "On the other hand, she bore little resemblance," she being the apparition, "she bore little resemblance to the orthodox notion of what the Virgin should look like. Bernadette did not see a mother with the infant Jesus in her arms, but a whitened image of youth, albeit resplendent and beautifully clad. Above all, she was small, as was Bernadette herself, and very young." Bernadette described Acero as un petito damisello, a little girl, and nothing disturbed commenters as much as this insistence that the apparition was a little girl. It was not a mother. It was a little girl. While the church had an orthodox repertoire of beliefs and practices actively promoted in the 19th century, the Pyrenees mountains in which this apparition was occurring added their own customs and often lived in a close relationship with the recently dead, hoping to satisfy their yearnings and fearing retaliation if they did not. This is not surprising to anybody who's kind of been around trad Cath culture. It's not at all surprising that there is like a mixture of pagan and Catholic beliefs in a lot of these cultures. The Irish do it, and the Pyrenees French did it as well. The Pyrenees Mountains being like a really rural area of French in the mid 19th century. And so revenants appeared as luminous apparitions in the night or as birds in accordance with Celtic legend. They communicated with the living by leaving marks on linens that only disappeared when the masses for the dead were said and prayers were offered, and they occasionally processed around the villages on the nights of All Saints, hungry for the food left out for them. So you can see here that the rural French Pyrenees culture had a mixture of pagan and Catholic beliefs here. And it seems as if the apparition of Our Lady kind of incorporated both. If we skip ahead to page 77, there's a little bit more about the appearance of Our Lady. Although her apparition bore little resemblance to Orthodox Marian imagery, its similarities with mythical creatures of Pyrenean folklore were much more marked. The site of the apparition was inhabited by the fairies, the dragas, the damisellos, hadas, fadas, and encanadas. The terms varied as the patois changed across the Pyrenean chain, who inhabited the forests, the bushes, the fountains, and above all, grottos of the region. By first calling the apparition un petito damisella, Bernadette chose to use the term to describe the apparition that described fairies, the little women of the forest, who would appear small, we're talking under 4 feet tall, glowing women who appeared in grottos in the forest. And that's the word that Bernadette used to describe this apparition. Like their Celtic counterparts, Pyrenean fairies appeared sometimes as serpents or cats, but much more often as enchanting little women, only a little bigger in dwarves. Dressed in luminous white, they were beautiful, capricious creatures linked to cosmic forces. So all of that should be pretty interesting, that this apparition seemed to incorporate pagan elements about forest fairies that would appear in grottos. Not at all an orthodox understanding of what an apparition is supposed to be like. Our Lady was asking Bernadette to do some pretty weird stuff during the apparitions too sometimes, which lasted for over an hour at a time. Our Lady was asking Bernadette to do penances, which included bathing in the dirty water like we saw in the film earlier. But what the film left out is that Our Lady also asked Bernadette to drink that dirty water. And the film also omitted some other requests that Our Lady made of Bernadette, such as kissing the mud. Our Lady also asked her to eat the random bitter plants that were growing around the grotto, and the film actually does have a brief scene where Our Lady tells Bernadette to eat one of the plants, and then Bernadette just grabs a plant and eats it. This was all penance for sinners. Penance for sinners was actually one of the only things that Our Lady talked about at Lourdes. Our Lady at Lourdes was uncharacteristically quiet, I suppose. At Mount Carmel, Our Lady gave Saint Simon Stock the scapular. At Fatima, Our Lady shared secrets and prophecies with the children about the coming world wars and the eventual assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. At La Salette, Our Lady told the children about the coming end of the world. At Lourdes, apparently Our Lady did tell Bernadette some secrets, but those secrets remained exactly that, secret. The secrets died with St. Bernadette in 1879. Our Lady of Lourdes apparently told Bernadette explicitly that she did not want anything to be written down, and most of what we do know that she said is just about penances. Penance, pray to God for the conversion of sinners. Would you crawl on your hands and knees and kiss the ground for the conversion of sinners? Penance, penance, penance. Go and drink at the spring and wash yourself there. Eat some of the grass that grows there. Otherwise, the only words that Our Lady spoke were to ask for a church to be built there, to say, I am the Immaculate Conception, to ask St. Bernadette to return there the next day and the following days. And that's about it. Most of the Lourdes mythos is not actually about those initial 18 appearances, though. It's mostly about the miracle healings that have occurred at Lourdes. So with that, let's move into a deeper dive on the miracle healings at Lourdes. I'm going to split the section on the deep dive on the miracle cures into two sections. First, I'm going to do a deep dive on the 7,000 plus healings that have been approved by the Lourdes Medical Bureau. And then after that, I will talk about the cream of the crop, the 70 miracles that were approved by the Vatican. I found a really cool open access paper published in the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, volume 69, called The Lourdes Medical Cures Revisited by Francois et al., which talks about the 7,000 plus miracles approved by the Lourdes Medical Bureau. To quote from the abstract, this article examines the cures recorded in Lourdes, France between 1858, the year of the Visions, and 1976, the date of the last certified cure of the 20th century. Initially, the records of cures were crude or non-existent, and allegations of cures were accepted without question. One interesting note is that this journal article actually quotes from Ruth Harris's book that we looked at earlier. You can actually see Ruth Harris's scholarly work, Lourdes, Body and Spirit in the Secular Age, is actually the second footnote in the entire paper. So that's kind of cool, that we're looking at those two sources there. So this journal breaks the miracles examined by the Bureau into 4 eras. The first of those 4 eras is the first 30 years from 1859 to 1889. Then after that, we go into the Golden Age of Lourdes from 1890 to 1915. After the Golden Age of Lourdes ends, we have the 2 world wars and the interwar period of 1919 to 1946. And then after that, we have the era of science in 1947 to 2006. Regarding the first 30 years, starting on page 140, I will quote from this work, quote, "It is impossible to determine the number of cures that occurred in Lourdes during the 9 years following the visions. Local authorities were aware of 2 to 8 cures each year, although the actual number may well have been larger. Diagnoses were based on dubious medical criteria or no criteria at all, and scanty data. Medical descriptions and clinical reports were virtually absent throughout the mid-1870s. That is not a great start to the collection of data. Although, to be fair, the Medical Bureau was not established in 1859. It wasn't until a decade had gone by or something like that that the Medical Bureau was established. And that's why you don't actually see any kind of medical certificates actually being awarded for official cures until the 1870s, even though those cures occurred in the 1850s. Regarding the golden years of 1889 to 1915, this journal article cites heavily from Gustave Boissary, the second president of the Lourdes Medical Bureau, serving from 1891 to 1917. Boissary wrote that, quote, "In Lourdes, there are no anatomical regeneration of organs. The body still bears the mark of the disease, although he does add that the cures were incredible by themselves. And you can see that quote here. Boissari also said that, quote, and this is on page 156, so let me go down here to page 156, quote, "We have neither the means of checking patients' declarations nor the opportunity of an independent inquiry. There are facts of unequal value in our recording of the cures. Gathering evidence will come later." And the authors of this article add, to our knowledge, very few patients were reevaluated, so that Boissari's method was at best inconsistent and at worst deceptive. On page 146, the authors say new factors came into play in the aftermath of World War I and until 1928. Lourdes fatigue, high turnover of physicians in charge of the borough, scanty data and sketchy reports, and as a result, poor records. No longer sacrosanct, Lourdes could be disparaged. Declarations to the borough and allegations of cures reached approximately 200 a year, and 100 or so patients were certified as cured. Tuberculosis was again the main condition, followed by neurological diseases, malignant tumors, GI tract disorders, and infections. About half of the patients stated that the cures had happened suddenly. The article does go on to say that things improved after 1928, with x-rays actually starting to be used more frequently for the first time. But the data from this period is still not great, though it is getting better. It isn't until after World War II that the practices at the borough seemed to improve to the point where the authors of the essay had, well, fewer complaints. Starting on page 147, the period from 1947 until 2006 was marked by new diagnostic tools, the appointment of younger physicians, more critical and cautious attitudes of the borough, now ready to reconsider and postpone decisions, and the creation of national and international committees designed to review the proposals of the borough and to give the final rulings. Original data dealings with the work of the borough and the committee are presented in Table 2. And then in Table 2, you can actually see the medical committee number of cures confirmed is way lower than it was in the prior years. So from 1947 to 59, only 14 were confirmed. Between 1960 and 72, only 8. And from 1972 to 90, 3. From 1991 to 2006, 0 cures confirmed. As medical practices improved, the number of cures confirmed decreased drastically. Compare that to the number of cures in previous years, and we're seeing, for instance, 40 cures for tuberculosis alone in 1909. 30 cures for tuberculosis alone in 1911. I mean, these numbers are remarkably higher in the first half of the 20th century than they are in the second half of the 20th century, after the borough started actually using x-rays and getting doctors who were a little bit more skeptical of the prior practices of the borough, and just perhaps ever so slightly more skeptical of miracle cures in general. And okay, maybe I'm placing too much emphasis on the 7,000 and not enough on the 7D. Sure, the 7,000 saw a marked decrease in miracles once medical technology actually improved and record keeping, just plain old record keeping actually improved. But those 7,000, perhaps the quality is shoddy, but the 7D approved by the Vatican, surely the quality of those have to be better, right? Let's discuss that now. The Lourdes Medical Borough website actually has a page that lists the 70 approved miracles, the 70 Vatican approved miracles. Very convenient. I went ahead and I took these 70 miracles, and you can see that there's the name, the region that they come from, and then the date of the recognition. I went ahead and I tabulated that in just an Excel file, just so I could kind of look at the data myself in a little bit more of a clear way than the list presented on the Lourdes Medical Borough website, just to see if anything would immediately jump out at me when I looked at the data in Excel. First thing that I should mention is that I wanted to check this data against the data presented by the paper that we looked at earlier This paper titled "Revisiting the Lourdes Medical," so the Lourdes Medical Cures Revisited. I wanted to check the 70 versus the 7,000 to make sure that there was overlap. So my understanding was that the 70 comes from the 7,000. So there were none in the 70 that were not in the 7,000, but I appear to be wrong about this. I'm actually still a little confused about this because I would have figured that it was this way, especially since the Lourdes Medical Bureau website says that they are the body that suggests to the Vatican, like, hey, you should look into this one. We think it's a miracle, but then the Vatican decides whether or not to approve it. But if we take a look at the data from Table 2 being the table that had the data from, in particular, 1991 to 2006, you can see that the Lourdes Medical Bureau approved 0 miracles between 1991 and 2006. 0. However, if we look for dates between 1991 and 2006 in the list of the official 70, we actually see 2, not 0, in that same time period. Jean-Pierre Belly from France was recognized in 1999, and Anna Santantiello from Salerno, Italy was recognized in 2005. So it appears that the Vatican approves some miracles without getting a recommendation from the Lourdes Medical Bureau, although most come from the Lourdes Medical Bureau, so it's not perfect overlap. Again, I'm still not positive about that, but that's how it appears to me. Now, when I look at this data, and I look at all of these dates, so I've tabulated all of the dates here, something jumps out to me right away. When I look at just like, for instance, the first 35, I notice that we are still in 1911. So there is not an even distribution of the miracles. The 70 are front-loaded. There were far more miracles in the first 75 years than in the second 75 years that have passed since the first miracles occurred at Lourdes. What if I just took all of the dates and I found the average date? The average date for all of the miracles it falls in November of 1929. When we consider what was going on in 1929, remember, the journal article by Francois et al. Was referring to this period as the era in which record keeping finally began to improve and x-rays actually still started to be used, but, quote, subjectivity still pervaded many medical decisions of this period. That quote comes from page 147, where it says subjectivity still pervaded much of the decisions of this period. Let me grab that for you right here, suggesting that subjectivity still pervaded many medical decisions of the period. That is what we're describing when we're talking about 1929. So that's not great that the average miracle occurred at a time that this journal article is just saying that, you know, the medical record keeping was not great. You stats guys are not going to have me look at the mean, the average, but rather the median. And the median is worse, falling in October of 1911 during the so-called golden era of Lourdes, when Dr. Boissary was in charge of the medical bureau. I know that I already mentioned that Dr. Boissary freely admitted that they were not and could not follow up on patients, and that gathering evidence would have to come later. But later on, in the Lourdes Medical Cures Revisited, Francois et al. Mention that Boissary was, and I'm going to go to page 155 here, quote, a mystic with little concern for earthbound details. Let's find that here. Boissary was considered intelligent, honest, and a proficient physician, although a little bit reserved. But his biographer described him as a mystic with little concern for earthbound details. Does that sound like a doctor to you? Or does that sound maybe like a religious fanatic? Continuing on page 156, it says that Boissary was often carried away by a deep-rooted faith and that he tried to convert colleagues to Catholicism. That seems like very inappropriate behavior for a medical doctor, a man who is trying to do science for a medical borough. In 1909, a contemporary of Boisserie named Alexis Carrel described Boisserie's work, saying that he has, quote, written these books as if he was a priest, not a physician, and that pious considerations were a substitute for observation. No rigorous analysis, no precise deduction. These books have been bestsellers, but have remained restricted to the faithful, and certainly have no scientific value. And that is right here. Bestsellers, but have remained restricted to the faithful and certainly have no scientific value. Page 156. Does this sound like real scientific inquiry to you? Or does it sound a lot like the science that has been done on Eucharistic miracles, where the scientists have all been devout Catholics who were not at all disinterested in the outcomes of the science? I argue that this should lower any Catholic's confidence, at least in the first half, the first 35 of the 70 miracles, because the medical records were just very poor at that time. But what about the other side of the average? What about the more recent 35? I will certainly admit that I am happier with the result of the more recent 35 than the first set of 35. But they are not without their problems. Take, for instance, the miracle cure of Vittorio Micheli, number 63 out of 70 of the Vatican-approved miracles. Vittorio had really bad bone cancer. His cancer ate away much of one side of his hip bone, so that one leg had become completely useless. He visited Lourdes in 1963 as a last resort. When he bathed in the water, though, he started to feel better, and soon enough, he was walking again. The official statement from the Lourdes Medical Bureau reads as follows: a remarkable reconstruction of the iliac bone and the cotyloid cavity has taken place. The stereotypes, which is another word for x-rays, made in 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1969, confirm categorically and without doubt that an unforeseen and even overwhelming bone reconstruction has taken place of a type unknown in the annals of world medicine. We ourselves have never encountered a single spontaneous bone reconstruction of such nature. Bone regrowth documented with x-rays? Well, this is certainly better than the total lack of documentation from the first half of the Vatican-approved miracles. But problems persist. The late, great James Randi published a book in 1987 called The Faith Healers, in which he investigates a few of the Lourdes miracles as well as a bunch of other faith healing related topics. But James Randi investigated in particular the case of Vittorio Micheli and noted some pretty crazy discrepancies in the medical records. For this book, James Randi worked with a team of secular medical experts, so he wanted to gather as much real evidence for the case of Vittorio as possible so that he could review that evidence with his team of medical experts. James Randi reached out to the Lourdes Medical Bureau to see if they would share the medical documentation with him, to no avail. Somewhere, writes James Randi, the original x-rays probably exist, but the medical board at Lourdes has not responded to requests to see them. Experts I have consulted want very much to consult those x-rays, particularly to determine if Michel's hip bone was completely regenerated, as the reports claim. That would call not only for bone structure to have been replaced, but also the complex ball and socket formation with its lubricants. If that did take place, it would be the first time such a regeneration has been recorded. And as a layman, I am astonished that this event did not make major news items in both popular and academic press. Also, apparently Vittorio was held in a hospital for 10 months without receiving any treatment for his cancer other than painkillers and vitamins. The x-rays of Vittorio's hip alone took 36 days to be taken. and the biopsy took 43 days, so like another week after the x-rays. Then they did the biopsy like a week later. And even though the official report from the Lourdes Medical Bureau says that the patient received no real treatment at the hospital other than just painkillers and vitamins, there are hints in the medical records that drugs and radiation may have been administered. One very effective medication in particular is mentioned. So the idea that Vittorio received no medical intervention at all for 10 months, not even an x-ray for a month and a half, is rather unbelievable. And if it is true, that amounts to medical neglect. More importantly, though, the medical team that James Randi worked with, and I'm reading here from the bottom of page 30 right here, the medical team that James Randi worked with said that if such a complete regeneration took place, that fact could only be determined with an exploratory surgery. X-rays cannot differentiate between a genuine regeneration and what is known as a pseudoarthrosis, in which case the bone structure is naturally replaced by more primitive arrangements that look similar in an X-ray photo and also allow adequate articulation of a joint. Such a regrowth is not at all unheard of. But the medical records at Lourdes do not show any surgical procedure being done to validate Michele's complete regeneration. Worst of all, though, for the Vittorio case are the dating concerns. The dates marked on the x-rays used as evidence by the Lourdes team to establish their miracle were actually weirdly dated. So the date marked on the x-ray used as evidence is 23/8/63. The x-ray was made 3 months after Michele was cured. Yet in June of 1963, 2 months before this complete destruction, the medical records say that he could walk without crutches, without pain. Are we asked to believe that he could walk without a left hip? James Randi also writes about the case of Sergei Perrin, who is number 64 out of 70. At the time, this was the latest official miracle approved by the Vatican. That's why it says the latest official miracle here. But James Randi says that the team in Lourdes declared Sergei cured miraculously of his paralysis without even running the required tests to see a spinal tap and a brain scan. They had not even been done to properly establish the cause of the condition. In fact, the American team of doctors said that Perrin's symptoms are classic signs of hysteria. In the absence of appropriate medical tests, hysteria was the more probable diagnosis. Furthermore, hysteria is known to respond favorably to highly emotional circumstances like those encountered at religious ceremonies. Ellen Berenstein, editor of the Medical and Health Annual of the Encyclopedia Britannica at the time that James Randi published this book, wrote the following about the Lourdes miracles, saying, "If Sergei Perrin's case is representative, there are good reasons to be distrustful of officially declared miracle cures at Lourdes. There are also reasons to question the allegedly rigorous system for recognizing them. The expertise and skills of the doctors are at best a matter of chance, since being present at the shrine and being a certified physician are the only requirements for joining the medical bureau." I can't go over all 70 of the official 70 approved Vatican miracles, much less the 7,000 miracles claimed by the Lourdes Medical Bureau. But from the start, Lourdes seems suspect, sensationalized at the very least. But even if we did grant that the 70 listed Vatican-approved miracles were real miracles, that's about in line what we would expect given spontaneous remission. Cancers go into spontaneous remission all the time. And given that for the past few decades, 4 to 6 million pilgrims have come to Lourdes each year, it is not shocking that the Vatican would find a few cases of spontaneous remission. I mean, the Wikipedia article for spontaneous remission actually lists that approximately 1 in 100,000 cancers go into spontaneous remission. So it's rare, But when Lourdes gets millions of pilgrims attending each year, we are bound to get a few hits. Saint Bernadette Soubirous was asked to kiss mud, eat random plants, and drink dirty water by an apparition that more closely resembled the Deamizelos, or the forest pixies of rural French legend, than of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The apparition didn't say a whole lot besides bossing Bernadette around. Then some superstitious townfolk believed that their medical ails were cured by the water at the grotto, where the apparition occurred. Irresponsible medical practices by a clearly religiously motivated team of medical professionals then added fuel to the fire. But as soon as medical technology improved, the rate of occurrence of miracle cures slowed to a trickle, a fraction of what it was during the golden age of Lourdes. All of this might be a downer for some folk. Lots of the pilgrims at Lourdes are there because they're desperate. All medical science thus far has failed them, so they turn to religion and they hope for a miracle. And while I don't want to steal anybody's hope from them, I also don't want people to place their hope in things that are not likely to work. I would like to end my video on a note by Dr. Patrick Thellier, a doctor for the Lourdes Medical Bureau, at least at the time of The Guardian's publishing of this article in 2004. 99% of the people who come here with a disease or handicap leave with their disease or handicap, says Dr. Thellier. But they feel better here, almost inevitably, due to the climate of fraternity that exists here, the fact that they are being attended to, the love and tenderness that is lavished on them. Instead of propping up bad science in an effort to try to give false hope, I hope that instead we can just foster fraternity and that we can all attend to the sick and needy with love and tenderness. Thanks, everybody. This is probably the longest non-live video that I've done, so if you stuck around all the way to the end, thank you so much. To reward you for sticking around to the end, let's do two little bonus features that just didn't really fit well into the script, I guess, but that I would like to throw in at the end. The first of which has to do with the image of the apparition as a forest pixie rather than Our Lady. Something that I thought was kind of interesting was that one thing that the forest pixies were known for was punishing people, right? So not just rewarding people, but also if you disrespect them, you get punished somehow. And apparently this did happen with the actual apparitions. If we go to page 78 in the book Lourdes, Body and Spirit in the Secular Age by Ruth Harris, you'll actually find a pretty weird story here. So you'll see here, let's go to the vision of the Virgin showed her willingness to engage in the daily affairs of men and women with severe punishments or quick rewards. Bernadette's apparition was also mercurial, for she did not always turn up on time, leaving the visionary bereft and accused of fraud. She could be severe, exacting a penitential devotion that the transgressor would never forget. For example, Jacques Laborde, a cabaret owner and a tailor known for the way he ignored his religious duties and questioned Bernadette's sanity, was punished swiftly for cursing after the wild rose bush caught his cap. So he was hanging out at the grotto and the rose bush caught his cap and he cursed. That very night he came down with terrible diarrhea and he had to wash all of his sheets, an act often seen in peasant society as a rite of purification. From that time forward, Laborde went to the grotto every morning, his hands joined, holding the rosary. When on my way to Lourdes of a morning, I often met him coming down, humbled, eyes lowered. He went like this to the grotto every morning. One could see from his humbled demeanor that he was doing penance. So again, you have Our Lady punishing somebody with diarrhea for cursing when his hat got stuck in a bush. That's a little weird, right? That doesn't sound like Our Lady, but maybe it does kind of sound like a forest pixie. Okay, we'll do one more fun fact. And this one is less, I guess, funny, and more just kind of something that I guess just opened up my eyes a little bit. So when you look at that list of the top 10 most pilgrimaged sites in the world, you notice that a bunch of them, most of them, are not Christian. In fact, you don't even guess what the first one is. At least I didn't guess what the first one is. What would you think the most pilgrimage site in the world is? Mecca? It's not. It's the River Ganges. So the River Ganges, and I'm speaking, out of just what I read in a tiny little article, but I guess the River Ganges is a very popular pilgrimage site for Hindus. And so the River Ganges gets more than 20 million pilgrims every single year. We were talking about 4 to 6 pilgrims per year at Lourdes, and I believe that Mecca gets something like 13 to 14 million per year. So the River Ganges is the most pilgrimage site in the world by a healthy margin. Mecca is the second, and then the shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe is the third. So Lourdes is the sixth. And then if you look at the rest of them, a lot of them are non-Christian sites. And so it's just kind of, I'll speak for myself here, but I'm sure that a lot of other kind of people in the Catholic YouTube space really get caught up in I guess just European trad Catholicism. I mean, I know that I do. So looking at a list like that and realizing that Catholicism doesn't make up a huge portion. I mean, it does, right? There's 1 billion Catholics in the world, but still that leaves 7 billion people who aren't Catholic. And sure, a lot of them are Christian, but non-Catholic Christians aren't generally making pilgrimages to the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City. I mean, I'm sure some are, but the vast majority are going to be Catholic. So I don't know. It's just kind of cool to think about how there are much bigger pilgrimage sites out there, and I guess there's just a whole world outside of European Catholicism that I don't really look at a whole lot, for better or for worse. I mean, for worse probably. And so I don't know. It's just kind of cool to be reminded that it's a big world out there, and maybe one day when I finally get over all of these Catholicism hang-ups, I'll finally actually, explore Hinduism a little bit. We'll see. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. If you hung out for this long with me, do you want to subscribe? I mean, it's almost been like an hour at this point. I feel like we're friends now. So subscribe. I'm getting close to 1,000. That'll be a cool milestone. And we'll talk again soon.